One thing I think that's very helpful then is for people to take time every morning to be working on the meaning in their work, to be thinking of the day ahead and to be thinking like, what are the motives that they most want to bring to it? That would be the best place if you could have some set time in the morning to get the heart resonating. Can you actually second, the affections? Can you have a motive of love? You'd actually, in a time of meditation, would make some kind of acts of thanksgiving. As you're doing those, you would try to mean the words more deeply. And as you do that, you might then start to get a sense of the resonance that's there.
Before we get started, if you enjoy these episodes, you might want to check out more at OptimalWork.com. Our website offers unique content, tools, and exercises to help you thrive at work and beyond. We have an in-depth masterclass covering our entire theory of growth, daily recommendations for personalized advice, and a platform to help groups and organizations learn and practice optimal work together. You can get a free trial at OptimalWork.com. Now let's start the episode. Hey, this is Sharif, here with another episode of the OptimalWork podcast, joined by Dr. Kevin Majors. Kevin, good to be back here with you again.
Hey, Sharif, thanks for having me back.
Yeah.
Celebrating also our millionth listen, right?
That's right. We've had 1 million listens now for the OptimalWork podcast. So very exciting in time for the anniversary of our founding of OptimalWork as a company too. So
yeah, just on our 7th anniversary, we hit it. Yeah.
And it's good, Kevin, that we do, I think it's fitting that we celebrate that with an episode on burnout, which is like, what do you do when you feel like, you're not making any progress at all? And how do you react to that, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So this was the topic we promised last week.
Yep. Yeah, that's right. So we've been talking about good and bad tired and adenosine. So if people haven't heard those are kind of helpful to understand what we're talking about here today. But just to dive in, the idea of burnout came from a Manhattan psychoanalyst, so Herbert Freudenberger, who wrote about it in 1974. He was being, I think, very generous and high-minded, working at these free clinics in Manhattan for no pay on his evenings. He would work as a psychoanalyst in the daytime, and then would be working with basically people who were homeless or drug addicts and people who were like falling through the cracks of social services in the East Side Manhattan. And what he was observing was that the other volunteers in this clinic they would start with a lot of ideals and a lot of energy, and then he would see this transformation that would come over them. And so he observed in them, this kind of, gradual kind of cynicism that was starting to show up, feeling kind of a little bit disconnected from the other people there, feeling like nothing really mattered, losing their drive. And then their work would really suffer from that. And he called it burnout for the first time. And that was a term taken from drug slang, actually, from people who were chronic substance abusers. So he thought that was somehow fitting to describe the non-drug using clinical staff. And that got taken up then by this UC Berkeley professor. And so Christine Masloch, who studied this in the 1980s and came up with this now canonical inventory of burnout symptoms. And so she ends up just basically codifying what this Freudenberger saw, which was that you have cynicism and emotional depletion or emotional exhaustion, and then reduced capacity for effective work. Okay, so that kind of, that triad of symptoms is now what we call burnout.
So my guess is, if you're working with, say, drug addicts and you're getting burned out or cynical about your work, the cause that immediately leaps to the fore in my mind is, well, if those people aren't making the progress, if you go there and you want to help people and then you think, well, actually, I'm not really helping anyone because they're not making progress. So that would be like why they're experiencing that, those symptoms. I'm guessing it's part of it, lack of progress.
Yeah, so somehow maybe they felt they're not effectively helping people at all. And then that is very distressing to caregivers. If you feel like you're not able to help people that you're really trying to serve, then that is definitely a source um, of stress, which really is a source of being in chronic threat mode, we could say. So that every challenge starts to feel more threatening. And the more people bring in their problems, every problem that they bring in is an even greater threat because you want this person to be thriving. So if you're not able to, you kind of start to dread more and more the problems that people have, and maybe the relapses that they have or the backsliding that they have. And so you're wishing you could do more, and it feels like it's getting harder and harder. So they're in a perfect situation, which many caregivers face, of every new challenge is an added burden. Therefore, challenges are threats. So now we know, as we get more into the neurobiology of what's happening in burnout, that the core biological process, probably the core biological process underlying burnout, is chronic threat mode. Because one of the things that changes in us when we're in threat mode is you get adrenaline initially. And so we all experience that from time to time when you go into threat mode briefly. And sometimes it's inconvenient. You're just getting to bed and you wonder, did I lock the door? So you think, you get this little surge of adrenaline to go and make sure the door is locked. But then it goes back to normal and you fall asleep normally. So little bits of threat mode come and go in ordinary life all the time. But with chronic threat mode, it's not so much a matter of adrenaline anymore. Now it's a matter of the cortisol that happens and and stays elevated. So cortisol is meant to help you also just, with ideally brief stresses, and it shifts how your body uses energy. But over time, it is responsible for changes in the brain that directly impact burnout. And in fact, we can say that the three main areas of the brain that cortisol works on and changes are, in fact, the same three areas that we saw in the last episode on where we experience the feelings of having bad tiredness. Or feeling bad tired. These three areas that maybe it's good that we just go through one by one.
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, good, because that's where cortisol shifts everything in terms of bad tired to accentuate it. So should I recap briefly bad tired, good tired?
Yeah, I think it's helpful for people who are maybe listening to this series for the first time. So we have the two types of adenosine receptors and where adenosine comes from and what it's doing.
Yeah, so adenosine is a tag that the brain uses once it's been exerting effort. So effort typically involves the creation of some adenosine because ATP you cleave off a phosphate and that gives you energy. And then the neurons do things with that energy. And then they can cleave off another one and another. And then until you find what you have left, ATP becomes adenosine because all the phosphates are gone. I mentioned last time that also the supporting cells around the neurons will release a lot of ATP and where it gets cleaved very quickly. And then you get a lot of adenosine. And it's these helper cells' way of telling neurons to calm down a bit. It doesn't want them to be overactive. But then ideally, as the neurons are able to have a little bit of a rest, then these helper cells they'll just vacuum up the adenosine during the breaks. And then you're ready again. The neurons will fire hard, and adenosine will accumulate, in between neurons, and then there's another break. So the ideal thing, if you want just to accumulate what we call the good tired feeling, is to work in this pattern of sprints and breaks so that there's ample time for the helper cells to clear adenosine. So if you're doing that, you're gradually accumulating a kind of type 1 adenosine tone, which is the good tired feeling that is what gives you sleep pressure at the end of the day and allows you to sleep. If, however, you have too much adenosine accumulating and it's not getting cleared away, that's going to tip you more towards type 2 adenosine receptors, which only start filling after the type 1 are filled. So they're the overflow, you could say. And the more those get activated, you start to then to feel, in fact, not just like the good tired feeling you have after solid work, or you actually start to feel depleted and demotivated. And it's meant to be, you could say, a deeper protective system. If you're striving too hard for things and you're not getting enough rest, then you're going to feel it. In fact, the surest way to get that type 2 feeling is to skip a night of sleep. Or to have really bad sleep one night. The next day, if you feel very worn out from not having rested, in fact, that you're going to be feeling type 2 adenosine tone, the bad tired feeling. Now, what's fascinating about this is, you have these distinct effects in what we call the septum. I'll call it the septal area. And then you have it in the striatum and the cortex. These three. We'll go through these in more detail. What's fascinating is that cortisol will enhance type 2 action in each of those three places. So the longer you're in threat mode, the longer you have high cortisol, what you get is a greater buildup of adenosine and an overexpression of adenosine type 2 receptors in those three areas, the septum, the striatum, and the cortex. So we can say then that that's the biological setting for burnout. Because now what you're going to have is even more type 2 activity. It's going to be, everything is now weighted even more towards type 2 because that's exactly what cortisol does. So we could say that burnout is bad tired on steroids because cortisol is a steroid hormone. So to say it's like, and in fact, that changes the brain to make you much more sensitive to type 2 and to increase the actual type 2 tone, which is the bad tired feeling.
So I think it'll be very interesting to go through these three areas of the brain, the septum you've mentioned already, and then that way you can see, okay, what effects this has in terms of someone who might have burnout or even some lighter form of burnout, and then also, to understand what causes this. You mentioned, cortisol flipping to this kind of type 2 tiredness. And then the cause of this cortisol increase is chronic threat mode, which I think comes from viewing challenges as negative, typically.
Yep. In some way, what it really means at the deepest level is that challenges are disconnected from meaning. And so what we'll see then is that, in fact, there are these three engines that when we're working at our best are all going together. And those engines are meaning, effort, and attention. Okay, and these are the three engines that you would like to see them, one flows into the other. And those correspond to the septum, the striatum, and the cortex. And it literally is a kind of flowing that has to proceed with meaning at the core of it. All right, so the septum, I think it's one of the most fascinating areas of the limbic system. It's also called the septal area, and the fascinating that it is in charge, you could say, of affective resonance. So the ability of you to feel the affections in your heart. So if you could feel a sense of love or gratitude or joy welling up in your heart, right, that actually is what the lateral, I'll just say in general, the septum does. In humans, it's a little broader than just the lateral septum. But at any rate, it's still the same idea. So you have then this kind of sense where when you really mean emotional words, that's another great way of thinking of it, that the meaning of it is actually the involvement of the septum. Okay, so that if you were to tell someone, thank you for doing that for me, you could imagine saying it in a way where the septum is disconnected and it doesn't have any resonance, no affective resonance. Or you could really put your whole heart into how you say it because you're really grateful and you really want them to experience your gratitude. What you do then is your your septal area will activate and it will resonate with this gratitude. And their septal area will also activate in response to that. So one septum speaks to the other, and you both resonate with it. If you say that it's someone that you love them, and you really put your heart into, or you're sorry for something, what you're doing is taking a concept and words that come from the cortex, but then you're connecting them to this hub, which is the septum, and that's where you join meaning and ideals and bonds. So it's like the very motive of what you're doing is now colored with this affection. And I say affective resonance because it's different than pure emotional resonance, because it is always about bonds. The septum in us simply corresponds to the bonds that we have with people. And so it's not simply any emotion, it's the bond-related emotions that are processed by the septum. And so the positive ones are always bond-related. But I think gratitude and love are two great ones to think of. The negative ones are also about bonds, but they're about absent or damaged bonds. And so there's like not having someone to rely on, feeling unsupported, feeling despair because there's no one to help you. So that sense of that's also very much the negative resonance in the septum. So when the engine's running well, you think that you're like that meaning can just flow then into your work. Your work is connected to ideals and bonds.
Before we continue, a brief message. If you're benefiting from these discussions, please take a moment to hit like and subscribe. Doing so helps us to reach more people. So you're not just learning, you're also helping others to discover a path of growth and flourishing. Thanks for your support. I guess you mentioned this kind of negative resonance, and then there's also kind of like coldness where there's just a lack of resonance, and I would guess both of those are in some way could be part of burnout. So maybe it would be helpful to complete the picture of what burnout entails in terms of the other two areas, and then talk about strategies for how to reverse this process.
Yeah, that's great. So then when it comes to cortisol, what it does in the septum is it will increase type 2 adenosine transmission. And what that will do is dampen the affiliative emotions, the like love and gratitude and feeling united, and will enhance a sense of isolation. And so the more type 2 transmission you have in the septal area, the more you have isolation and pessimism and ultimately despair. So that corresponds then to the first thing that Maslow mentions, which is the first symptom category, which is cynicism, or feeling like isolated, depersonalized. Now, the next engine then would be the striatum. And the striatum's job is to translate the affection, from the septum into work itself and effort. So it's the engine of effort. And so when it's working well, a sense of love and purpose in your work can just lead you to more easily initiate and can sustain activity. So it allows you to have intensity in your work, that put intense effort into it. Now, what's fascinating about cortisol there is cortisol will work to increase the expression of type 2 adenosine receptors and increase adenosine levels in the striatum directly, so that you end up with more of this type 2 tone. Now, those adenosine type 2 receptors, when they get activated, they're bonded with dopamine receptors in the striatum, and they block dopamine from having its effect. So you have this anti-dopamine surge in the striatum. And what that feels like is futility and frustration. It feels like it's not working and it's not worth it. And that corresponds then to Maslow's idea of emotional exhaustion and a loss of drive. That just you have the sense that your work has become unrewarding And the effort itself is now even punishing. Right? Like if you're to turn up the dial of adenosine type 2, fully, it's like now all effort just feels punishing. But the striatum is needed. That's the effort engine, because that's what allows you to then have the attention engine, which is what the cortex provides. The ideal thing is that, like, when the cortex is riding the waves of meaning and effort coming from below, you're able to then sustain attention to every detail, to be caring, to be thoughtful, to really carry out well, how you're about to do the task. It's fascinating that actually just the meaning engine is all about why you're doing it, and ultimately, is it about bonds? Is it resonating with bonds? The striatal engine, which is the effort engine, is all about what you're doing to actually initiate and sustain the task itself. But then the cortex is about how you do it. And here, dopamine is what allows you to do it very well. And the striatum, and so when love is plugged in your the septal area, that love is going to trigger a cascade of dopamine in the striatum to initiate things, and in the cortex to do them well. Dopamine in the cortex helps you to work well. But again, cortisol affects the cortex by increasing the adenosine signaling, and particularly in the type 2 direction. And again, the type 2 signal is going to be blunting the effect of dopamine in the whole cortex, making it harder to sustain focus. So your attention gets more fragmented, and it's harder to stay on task. So you're more likely to be multitasking. And then on top of that, if you have a person who's worrying and ruminating, then they don't even really have breaks from their task, which further depletes the cortex because they're always thinking about things. And that further leads to adenosine accumulating and more type 2 effect. And that corresponds to Maslow's idea that there's a loss of efficacy in work, that people just lose the ability to work well. And that's like the last of the part of the triad that constitutes burnout.
So, well, it seems like, I guess the meaning is kind of at the foundation, and then the effort, you kind of mentioned it flows from meaning through effort, then to effectiveness or to attention. But it also seems like there's a relationship between this and burnout that, on the one hand, a lack of meaning, a lack of effort, and a lack of attention causes burnout, and then also is caused by burnout. So I'm just kind of wondering, like, okay, if we want to then fix this or reduce burnout or avoid burnout in the first place, like where do we start?
Yep. So that's great. And so anything that helps people recover from the bad, tired feeling, as we were talking about last time, tipping the adenosine system just to the type 1 receptors, where you briefly accumulate some and then you clear it, and you briefly accumulate and then clear, rather than the always on adenosine tone that leads to the type 2. The way to do that would be having restorative breaks, unitasking. So working very clearly in a sprint and break pattern, and then never multitasking in your work. Getting good sleep, getting good exercise, the good nutrients. All of that helps in some way, but doesn't really get to the deeper issue, which I think you're addressing here. So what we want to do is actually bring the heart back into our work. There is a kind of discouragement, like a losing of heart in work, that is represented by burnout. And the deepest solution is to get the heart resonating again with motives of love and service, so that they can, again, like let the engines work together. And so we talk a lot about reframing, right, in OptimalWork. And so if you can see a challenge as an opportunity to deepen a bond, to really serve someone in a way that brings out your best, that sense of reframing is already going to be speaking then to what you're wanting to resonate with. What are the qualities that you most want to be incarnating in your work? Okay, so that's like the central practice. One thing I think that's very helpful then is for people to take time every morning to be working on the meaning in their work, to be thinking of the day ahead, and to be thinking like, what are the motives that they most want to bring to it? That would be the best place if you could have some set time in the morning to get the heart resonating. So, and to see like, can you actually second, the affections? Can you have a motive of love? Uh, just take, for instance, how you could practice gratitude, right? So you'd actually, in a time of meditation, would make some kind of acts of thanksgiving, right? And as you're doing those, you would try to mean the words more deeply. And as you do that, you might then start to get a sense of the resonance that's there. That's what you want to savor and rejoice and second in. So you're with your will seconding this movement, right? And then that makes it easier to actually say and mean the words in your head. And you resonate a little more, and then you rejoice in that. That makes it easier. So there's this feedback loop. That's actually a little microcosm of how we can get the heart resonating again, and bring it into our work. You can then, I think, carry that sense of resonance into the tasks of the day. So try to like use the morning to get, and then, I think if that seems difficult, then another way of doing it is think of the people that you love the most and some act of service that you do for them in the course of a given day. And then try to put more love into that by pausing briefly before you do it. So that too, like why we don't have to practice, the meaning engine, getting that geared up where it's hardest. Why not practice where it's easiest? I think that's a really solid approach too. Try to be like finding the people who it's easiest to have a spirit of love and service with, and then deliberately try to feel the resonance there before you do the act. Those are some ideas. Yeah.
Now, Kevin, let me challenge this a little bit, because thinking about the original psychotherapist, psychiatrist, or psychologist in New York who coined the term burnout, and the therapists he's working with who are burning out, dealing with the homeless or drug addicts. And I mean, he might have identified the problem as, well, these people are working, but they're not really seeing any results for their efforts. So maybe they work really hard every day and never see any progress in people. And that's what causes them to burn out, you might think. So how do you address that particular problem where maybe you went into it with high ideals, you went into it with noble aspirations, whatever endeavor, but it just is not bearing fruit, and that leads to this kind of burnout? What would you say?
And what you're bringing up is one of the main divisions in how people think about burnout. Is it a result of systems and externals, or is it a result of these internal dispositions? As you can see, I'm entirely on the side that my idea is what we can change are the things within our control. And these internal dimensions are within our control. But isn't there a little bit of a clue even in the Freudenberger story, which is that he was working full days as a psychoanalyst. And so we don't really know, was he a psychiatrist or a psychologist? Probably a psychiatrist, but it's not, I don't know enough about him to tell you. But at any rate, so he was a guy who did psychoanalysis all day long. And then in the evenings was going to these clinics to work with people. So when he would have needed the restorative rest. So you can already see that if there had been a greater sense of giving people time to restore themselves, rather than working at all hours and having these extended work days, I think the extended work days violate the effort engine and giving it time to restore. Having clear breaks is crucial to being able to have effort in tasks. And if you're working excessively long hours, maybe that is objectively needed for your job, and hopefully that's not a long-term thing. If it is a long-term thing, then you really have to seriously think, what can you do to have more restoration during the job day? So I think that if we control what we can with the principles we've been talking about, you actually can prevent burnout from happening, but you may not prevent total bad tired. I don't think there's any job that necessarily requires bad tired plus cortisol. And so I think it's that combination that produces burnout. So I think there's so much that we can do in both sides of that equation that it should be preventable.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess, I mean, we got to wrap up here. We're kind of out of time. But just to finish, I mean, I guess when I said that you're not seeing any results for your efforts, part of that is actually tweaking the meaning engine, as you called it, to actually start to see, even if there aren't external fruits, that there's still, to reframe what you're actually aiming for in your work so that you do see
Exactly.
progress.
Yeah. And so when we're talking about what is it then that leads to threat mode, which seems to be a necessary ground for burnout? Really what we're talking about there is what's called a septal mode. And the septum has two modes. One of them is threat mode, and then the other is bonded affiliative safety mode. And so it can happen though so when bonds are our ultimate goal, we are going to more likely then be in that safe mode in the septum and experience more sense of love and appreciation for others and being other-centered. What puts us more into threat mode is actually when we're focused on outcomes, and not getting the outcomes that we want. And so if you're working with people who are really sick and your main goal is bonding with them and forming a relationship and doing what you can to be encouraging to them, I don't think that has to be discouraging, right? But if you're trying to achieve certain metrics of progress, I think if you have outcomes in mind, the outcome mentality is separated from bonds. And so there's nothing to buffer then in the septum and goes into the threat mode much more easily. So in a sense, the saying of scripture that perfect love casts out fear, that's literally what happens in the septum. The more love dominates as a motive, then the less you're going to be subject to the threat mode that comes from outcomes being at risk. So there's, I think, a strong sense of meaning is the foundation for a kind of wellspring of effort, which then sustains your attention through the task. And then as you're actually serving people, that can feed back into the sense of meaning. Because in fact, when we really serve people well, we actually then bond with them even more. So that act of service forms the bond even deeper, which allows then the meaning to deepen, which then allows the effort to continue more, which then perfects the service more. So this is the real virtuous cycle of vitality. And I think that is what can treat burnout, should it be developing, but can also entirely prevent it.
Well, Kevin, thanks so much. I think that's a great note for us to end on here today. And we'll be back next week, even building further on this approach.
That's right. This will keep going.
Wonderful. Okay. Well, thanks so much, Kevin. We'll be back.
Thank you, Sharif.
Thanks for tuning in to today's episode. If you enjoyed our conversation and you're looking for more in-depth guidance, check out OptimalWork.com, our unique platform that delivers content, tools, and exercises to help you thrive at work and beyond.